She had everything the world desired, but the one thing she needed most would destroy her 3 times over. The first time Evelyn Sinclair understood the weight of beauty, she was 7 years old, standing in a department store while strangers stopped to stare. Her mother's hand tightened around hers, not in protection, but in presentation. "Look at her," they whispered. "Look at those eyes, like violets, like something not quite real." Her mother smiled, tilted Evelyn's chin upward toward the light, and in that moment the child learned that she was not a person, but a spectacle. Not a daughter, but a commodity. The cameras would come later, but the transaction had already begun. Hollywood found her the way it found all beautiful things, by accident that felt like destiny. A studio scout saw her photograph in a magazine, her face framed by dark curls and those impossible eyes, and within weeks she was standing on a soundstage, learning to cry on cue, learning to smile when she felt nothing, learning that her feelings mattered less than her face. She was 9 years old when she signed her first contract, 10 when she became famous, and 11 when she realized she would never belong to herself again. The roles came in waves: innocent daughters, tragic heroines, women who loved too much or not enough. She learned to inhabit other lives because her own had been taken from her before she understood what she was losing. Between takes, she sat in her dressing room and studied her reflection, searching for the girl she might have been if someone had let her be ordinary. But ordinary was not an option. Ordinary did not sell tickets. Ordinary did not make men weep or women dream. So she became extraordinary, and extraordinary became her cage. By 16, she was the most photographed girl in America. By 18, she was married for the first time, a hotel heir with gentle hands and empty eyes who loved the idea of her more than the reality. The wedding was a spectacle, covered by every newspaper, attended by everyone who mattered, and she walked down the aisle in a dress that cost more than most people earned in a year, smiling for cameras that had been there since childhood, cameras that had watched her grow from girl to woman to myth. The marriage lasted 8 months. The photographs lasted forever. The second husband came quickly, as if to prove something, to herself, to the world, to the voice in her head that whispered she was only valuable when she was wanted. He was an actor, handsome in the way Hollywood preferred, with a jawline made for close-ups and ambitions that matched her own. They fought like performers, every argument a scene, every reconciliation a closing shot. She learned that love could be a performance too, that passion could be manufactured, that intimacy could be faked as easily as a death scene. When he left her for another actress, younger and hungrier and not yet tired of pretending, she did not cry. She had forgotten how to cry unless someone called action first. The roles grew darker, more complex, more demanding. She played women destroyed by desire, women who chose love over survival, women who burned bright and died young. The critics called her fearless. The directors called her difficult. The studio called her their most valuable asset, then their most expensive problem. She missed rehearsals, arrived late to set, demanded rewrites, fired assistants, and through it all, she remained undeniably, impossibly, devastatingly watchable. The camera loved her even when she hated herself, especially when she hated herself, because suffering looked like artistry through the lens, and her suffering was becoming legendary. The third husband was different. He was older, wiser, a man who had survived his own kind of fame and understood its cost. He did not ask her to be smaller or quieter or more convenient. He loved her loudly, publicly, recklessly, in a way that made headlines and broke rules and scandalized everyone who believed love should be polite and private and contained. They married in a ceremony that shut down a city block, honeymooned on a yacht that cost more than some countries' budgets, and fought with the intensity of people who knew that intensity was all they had. He gave her jewels that weighed more than her bones. She gave him devotion that nearly killed her. For 3 years, they were the most famous couple in the world. For 3 years, she believed that maybe, finally, someone saw her instead of her face. But fame is a jealous lover, and it does not share. The photographers followed them everywhere, turning meals into photo opportunities, arguments into entertainment, private grief into public consumption. When she miscarried their first child, the newspapers reported it before her mother knew. When he began drinking, the gossip columns tracked every bottle, every slurred word, every stumble. Their love became a spectacle, and spectacles always end in tragedy or boredom, and boredom would have been kinder. He died on a Tuesday afternoon in a private hospital room with her hand in his, and for the first time in her life, she was grateful for the camera's absence. His death was hers alone, her grief unperformed, her loss unwitnessed. She buried him in a cemetery where tourists could not reach, marked his grave with a stone that bore no photographs, and returned to work 2 weeks later because work was all she knew, all she had ever known, all she would ever be allowed to be. The fourth husband, the fifth, the sixth. They blurred together like scenes from different films, each man a variation on the same theme. She married actors and businessmen and politicians, men who wanted to possess her, and men who wanted to save her, and men who simply wanted to say they had been close to something beautiful. Each wedding made headlines. Each divorce made more. She collected engagement rings like trophies, wore diamonds like armor, and learned that jewelry was easier to trust than people because jewelry did not pretend to love you back. The pills started as a solution for pain, for sleep, for the anxiety that clawed at her chest during long shoots, for the depression that waited in her dressing room like a faithful assistant. The doctors prescribed them easily, casually, the way they prescribed everything to stars who could not afford to be human. One pill to wake up, one to calm down, one to sleep, one to forget. She swallowed them like sacraments, these tiny chemical promises of relief, and for a while, they worked. For a while, she could smile through exhaustion, perform through heartbreak, exist through the endless grinding machinery of fame. But pills are patient, and addiction is generous. It takes everything you offer and asks for more. The seventh husband found her unconscious in their bathroom, her skin the color of marble, her breathing shallow as a whisper. The ambulance came with its sirens off, a courtesy extended to celebrities, a way to protect the image while saving the body. She woke in a private hospital room to flowers she did not remember ordering and concern she did not believe. The studio issued a statement about exhaustion. The tabloids speculated about suicide. She said nothing because silence was safer than truth, and truth would not fit the narrative everyone had written for her. Rehab was a revelation and a humiliation. She sat in circles with people who recognized her face but not her pain, who saw the icon but not the woman, who asked for autographs between group therapy sessions. She learned that addiction was democracy's great equalizer, that suffering did not care about box office receipts, that her beauty meant nothing to the chemicals that had rewired her brain. She learned to say the words, "I am an addict, I need help, I cannot do this alone," and each word felt like swallowing glass. But she said them anyway because survival required surrender, and surrender was the one role she had never played. The comeback was calculated, carefully staged, a masterpiece of publicity and performance. She chose a role that demanded vulnerability, a character ravaged by time and poor choices, a woman who looked like she had lived through something real. The critics called it her finest performance. The Academy gave her an award. The audience wept, and she stood on that stage, holding a golden statue, and understood with perfect, terrible clarity that they were not celebrating her survival. They were celebrating the entertainment value of her suffering. She had nearly died, and they had turned it into a redemption arc. She had been broken, and they had called it brave. The eighth husband was the one who stayed, not because he was perfect, but because he was patient, not because he understood her completely, but because he stopped trying to. He was a builder, a man who worked with his hands, who knew how to fix things that were broken without pretending. They had never been damaged. He did not care about premieres or parties or photographs. He built her a house in a place where neighbors did not recognize her, where she could walk to the market without being followed, where morning coffee was not a performance. He gave her the one thing fame had stolen: privacy, the luxury of being ordinary. But ordinary did not pay the bills. Ordinary did not maintain the lifestyle she had built, the staff she employed, the image she had spent decades crafting. So she returned to work, older now, playing mothers instead of ingenues, supporting roles instead of leads. She watched younger actresses take the parts she once owned, watched them make the same mistakes, watched them learn the same lessons about beauty and value and the price of being wanted. Sometimes she wanted to warn them. Mostly she stayed silent because warnings only matter to people who believe consequences are real, and young beauty never believes in consequences. The activism came later, born from grief and rage, and the understanding that suffering should mean something beyond entertainment. She threw herself into causes, disease research, human rights, anything that let her channel decades of pain into something resembling purpose. She testified before Congress, her face older but still arresting, her voice steady with the authority of someone who had survived what should have killed her. She raised millions, changed policy, saved lives, and in those moments, standing before rooms full of powerful people, demanding they see beyond her face to her message, she felt something close to freedom. The ninth husband was a mistake, but at that point, mistakes felt like old friends. He was younger, ambitious, drawn to her fame like a moth to a very expensive flame. The marriage lasted 14 months. The divorce lawyers made more than he did. She laughed about it at dinner parties, turned her heartbreak into an anecdote, performed her own life as if it were a screenplay written by someone else. People said she was resilient. People said she was strong. People had no idea that resilience was just another word for having no choice but to continue. Her body began to fail in ways that could not be fixed with surgery or makeup or lighting. The years of pills and alcohol and stress and starvation diets and the relentless pressure of being beautiful had taken their toll. She underwent surgery after surgery, each procedure making headlines, each recovery photographed from a distance by cameras with powerful lenses. Her pain became public property, her medical history entertainment. She was dying slowly, publicly, and the world watched with the same fascination they had shown when she was born into the spotlight, as if her suffering was a performance created for their benefit. The final husband was not really a husband at all, just a companion, a man who held her hand through the worst of it and asked for nothing in return. He was not famous, not ambitious, not trying to save her or possess her or profit from her. He was simply there, a steady presence in the chaos, and maybe that was the closest thing to love she had ever known, someone who stayed without needing her to be anything other than human. She wrote her memoirs, in the end, though she did not call them that. She called them a reckoning, a confession, an attempt to take back the narrative that had been written about her since childhood. She wrote about the men who had loved her and the men who had used her, and the impossibility of knowing the difference. She wrote about the pills and the pain and the relentless, grinding machinery of fame that had taken a child and turned her into a commodity. She wrote about the thing she had needed most, the thing that had destroyed her 3 times over, to be seen, not admired, not desired, not photographed or documented or analyzed, but simply seen. To be known as a person rather than a symbol, a woman rather than an icon, a human being rather than a headline. The book became a bestseller, of course. Everything she touched turned to gold, even her suffering, especially her suffering. People bought it in airport bookstores and read it on beaches, consuming her pain like entertainment, and she understood that this was her legacy, to have lived a life so spectacular that even its destruction was beautiful. She had wanted to be seen, and instead she had been watched. She had wanted to be loved, and instead she had been desired. She had wanted to be free, and instead she had been famous. In her final years, she retreated from the spotlight that had claimed her at birth. She lived in that house her eighth husband had built, surrounded by photographs of lives she had lived and people she had lost. She kept the jewels not because they mattered, but because they were the only permanent thing in a life built on impermanence. She watched old films late at night, studying the face that had made her fortune and stolen her freedom, trying to remember the girl she had been before the cameras found her. When she died, the world mourned the icon. The tributes poured in, the montages aired, the retrospectives analyzed her life as if it were a text to be studied rather than an existence that had been lived. They talked about her beauty, her talent, her resilience, her scandals, her comebacks. They counted her marriages like achievements, her films like conquests, her struggles like plot points. They made her death into another chapter of the story they had been telling about her since she was 7 years old, standing in that department store, learning that she was not a person, but a spectacle. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the headlines and the tributes and the inevitable documentaries, there was a different truth. She had been a girl who wanted to be loved for herself, who had been given fame instead. She had been a woman who wanted to be seen, who had been watched instead. She had been a human being who wanted freedom, who had been given everything except the one thing that mattered, permission to be ordinary. She had everything the world desired, the beauty, the fame, the fortune, the legend, but the one thing she needed most, to be known rather than observed, loved rather than desired, free rather than famous, had destroyed her 3 times over. Once when she was young and did not understand what she was losing. Once when she was broken and tried to escape through chemicals and chaos. And once at the end, when she finally understood that the price of fame was not paid in money or time or even happiness, but in the slow, relentless erasure of the self. The cameras had found her at 7. They followed her until the end. And somewhere between those 2 moments, a girl named Evelyn Sinclair had disappeared entirely, replaced by an image so powerful that even she could not remember who she had been before the world decided who she should be. That was the price. That was always the price. To be everything to everyone until you were nothing to yourself.